I want to address a topic that was brilliantly held yesterday. I hope not to obscure the beautiful discussion of yesterday with my remarks. Glaube, between belief and faith. Last January, I held a short but remarkably interesting talk with our conveners, Roberto Rubio and Emilio Vicuña, on the topic of the world belief and God belief. The discussion pivoted on the status of the belief in God, and it was contended that such a belief cannot be considered on par with ordinary belief like the perceptual, but it rather enjoys a particular status similar to the world belief proper to the natural attitude at large. At issue was a fragment from Max Scheler where he elaborates an ambiguity that the German word Glaube conveys, which can mean belief but also faith, as we all know. Scheler argues that behind this word distinction, there is a real difference, although also a community between the two meanings, which is already revealed in its usage. The German language has on the one hand expression Glauben von etwas, and on the other Glauben an etwas. The first one means to believe that something is so and so, whereas the second means to believe in. It refers to something or someone that or who is believed, and hence faith. According to Scheler, there is a further difference that concerns the grounding that is needed for believing that, which makes it always relative, and the lack, or even, says Scheler, impossibility of grounding in the case of believing in faith. On the part of the acts, faith is an installation of the person as a whole towards what's believed, or as Scheler says, towards the being real of the corresponding absolute value thing. While belief is a particular act of a person in a net of particular acts, and thus does not involve the person as a whole. I found the idea interesting and intriguing at the same time, and I began looking into Husserl's text in order to find out whether he had considered the difference at issue, and if so, how had he dealt with it? My point is that religious belief, faith, is not on par with the belief at stake in the general thesis of the natural attitude, but nonetheless, it enjoys a special status in contrast to ordinary beliefs. What I can offer here is only a provisional and sketchy account of what I think I have found out. I will proceed by first recalling what Husserl says in general on the topic of beliefs. Then I will consider the very special case of the belief involved in the natural attitude, in order to finally examine the belief in God. So, first part, a static and genetic constitution of belief. The most suitable way for examining belief in general is, in my opinion, to take as point of depart the noematic side of intentional correlation. This is precisely what Husserl does in the first book of the Ideas. There he considers the full noema as the complete correlate of the operations of consciousness or noesis presided by the I. Now, this full noema has a complex structure that includes many kinds of elements. Husserl first discloses two major dimensions, that of the sense proper, which he calls the noematic core, noematischer Kern, and the being characteristics, Seinscharakter. Whereas the noematic core is the correlate of the specific sense-giving feature of the acts, the being characteristics display in an unity the variety of thetic or toxic characters of the noesis. These features, sense-giving and thesis, are already present in the logical investigations under the label of matter and quality, and are referred solely to the noetic side of consciousness. On a closer analysis, they show an important breakpoint with Brentano's understanding of the acts. For Brentano, the most elementary form of an act is a pure representation, Vorstellung, and any act is either a representation or is based on a representation. Although Husserl retains this distinction, at least in the name, it works differently as for Brentano. Brentano thought pure representation, as a Vorstellung, as the act of merely presenting something, for example, perceptually, before consciousness. But what Husserl terms quality and later thesis is not, according to Brentano, a component of the act, but the core component of an act of judgment that can be built upon mere representation. Husserl located, so to speak, the quality component inside the very act of simply representing, that is, of perceiving something. A judgment is a complete and different act that may be based on a perception, but is not itself one. As we shall see, this inner component of the act will play a crucial role in the characterization of the natural attitude. Husserl had already employed the words Glauben and belief in the logical investigations. In the famous example of the lady and puppet, he shows precisely that quality is contained in simple perception acts. Moreover, this inclusion of the thetic component in the sense itself, prior to any explicit act of judgment, allows Husserl to extend the notion of proposition, by which he understands the unity of the sense core or matter with a being characteristic or quality. Now, one central feature of the thetic characteristic is that it admits modalization. That is, it has a primal or unmodalized form, an form, that admits modal changes, being modalities, ranging from certitude to doubtfulness. On the noematic side, being characteristics mirror these modulations. Something can be posited as really existent, this is the form, or as possible, probable, doubtful, questionable. In turn, the cases of affirmation and negation as pertaining to the judgment, stricto sensu, are modifications of a higher order. All such characters, whether of a simple or higher order, are crisscrossed by a different modality, that of neutrality. While acts of perception, recollection, and expectation always come with a certain thesis or a modalization thereof, acts of imagination are characterized by not positing any thesis. They live in suspense or bracket any positionality, and this is why they are similar to the epoche. Any thesis can, in principle, change to neutrality form, which leaves existence out of consideration. This is also what happens in complex presentifications, so vergegenwärtigungen, like portraits or signs, where the picture or the sign is a physical thing in the world, has its existent characteristic suspended in order to allow the depicted object or the meaning appear. In all these cases, the thesis is left undecided as to the existence of the meant object. Thus, any positive noema ideally has a neutralized counterpart or counter noema, Gegennoema. Now, in his genetic analysis, Husserl confirms the structure of sense and being characteristic for the elementary acts of perception, which he now calls pre-predicative experience, vorprädikative Erfahrung, in order to stress the difference with the level of judgment in the sense proper. To perceive something is to contemplate individual objects and to be able to disclose its various senses. But precisely this disclosure or explication requires that something pre-objective be there at disposal for the act to apprehend it. In the most original form, such are the sense fields that are pre-given to any sense-giving act. Sense fields are not merely a chaotic bunch of sense data, but a complex, multi-layered organization of passive accomplishments. As the general intentional form encompassing every further formation, there is the continuous synthesis of time, yielding the universal forms of coexistence and succession. But sense data have furthermore a material organization by means of associative synthesis of similarity and contrast, yielding a field with reliefs in foreground and other data in the background. Data thus possess an effective force they exert on the eye in the form of a stimulus, capable of affecting the eye and making it turn to the salient data in order to objectify them. What is also new in this genetic view is the inclusion of the horizons of habitualization. Experience has not only a sense component, but also a horizon of both possibilities of further explanation and capabilities of the eye. This allows Husserl to introduce, on the noematic side, the notion of type, typus, as a sedimentation of already acquired senses and aspects of the objects. The thesis with which a type is intended is not active, but passive, a passive doxa. And interestingly, the general ground burden of this passive belief in beings is the world. This brings us to the next topic, the question of a belief underlying every belief while not being exactly a belief like any other, passive or active. It is the thesis of the natural attitude. As we all know, Husserl links his phenomenological method with a change in the philosopher's attitude, which he calls the phenomenological attitude and contrasts with our everyday attitude, which he terms the natural attitude. Only this change allows one to turn from the naive point of view, which is still at work in scientific thinking, to a reflective, critical standpoint directed to the things themselves, to the phenomena in a rigorous manner. What is the meaning of this so important notion, attitude? An attitude is a subjective behavior, and not a passive one, but one that becomes habitual. That is, in principle, always at disposal of the eye. One could say that the word Husserl employs, Einstellung, refers to something like being installed, stellen, in a certain manner. I guess Emilio's presentation of this very topic yesterday was far better than mine. Einstellung, and more precisely, sorry, an attitude is always referred to an object or a constellation of objects. Furthermore, such reference is not blind. Things seen under an attitude are seen as something very definite. Let's say we are dealing with a demonstration of a theorem in geometry. Then we are held in the geometric attitude. Our attention is focused on the elements of the theorem and relations among them, as well as on the operations needed for the demonstration. This example also shows that an attitude is voluntary, even if it is habitual. We may enter the geometric attitude as well as leave it anytime. Our everyday life is pervaded by attitudes we take in the different contexts we have to deal with along our lives. Our being conscious is not a mere flow of momentary states of mind, but a manifold of habitualized behaviors, that is, attitudes, every one of which has its something referred to, the context of its functioning, as well as a peculiar way of seeing it. Attitudes can either be theoretical, practical, or axiological. They are always associated with interests, so that they are never aimless but motivated. Finally, attitudes are not only personal or individual, but also intersubjective. That is, they are shared, learned, and taught. A summary of these features is to be found in a passage of the Crisis, where Husserl says that an attitude bespeaks a habitually determined manner of vital willing, wherein the will's directions or interests, its aims, and its cultural accomplishments are pre-indicated and thus the overall orientation determined. Provided that attitudes are voluntary, another feature peculiar to them is that they can begin or end anytime, as it happens, for example, with a geometrical attitude, or in general with a professional attitude. Furthermore, they usually have to be learned, as it is clear with the professional attitudes. and they can also be abandoned and even relearned again. It applies to then what Husserl describes with regard to institutions in general. There can be a primary institution of an attitude and a Urstiftung, and a reinstitution and a Nachstiftung. Now, there is, according to Husserl, an attitude, brackets, that does not work this way. One that, properly speaking, does not begin at a definite point in time and does not end at all. One that is never learned nor abandoned, and for essential reasons. This attitude lies at the very bottom of our most elementary and basic being in the world. That is, at our basic perceptual installation in the world. As such, it does not change, but accompanies every particular attitude as a general background. It is what Husserl terms natural attitude. When compared with ordinary attitudes, this natural one has some further peculiarities. To begin with, it is not voluntary, and its theme is not a special set or region of objects, like the constellation of the tools in a carpenter's workshop, or the ideal figures in geometry, but the world itself as perceived and perceptible. Thus, the correlated thesis has the general theme world, in this sense of the word theme. But properly speaking, the world in this sense is not a theme at all, because it is pre-given, vorgegeben. In this basal attitude, the world is presented to us in the flesh, leibhaftig, in an originary manner as here and now endowed with past and future horizons. The processes of habitualizing, that is, of acquiring new attitudes, as well as dehabitualizing, that is, leaving already acquired attitudes, have this general thesis as their general background. This implies, in turn, that the general thesis is not itself the result of a process of habitualization, and also that it cannot be dehabitualized. Husserl calls it, as we all know, the general thesis, Generalthesis, of the natural attitude. Although he speaks here of a thesis and compares it with an implicit or potential judgment in contrast with the explicit or actual one, this is a misleading formulation which he would criticize in his later years. Already when he is introducing the question of the natural attitude in ideas, Husserl points out that while we are living in a world of a particular attitude like the geometricians, the natural world remains on hand. Afterwards, and as well as before, I am in the natural attitude, undisturbed in it by the new attitudes. Interestingly, the later texts usually speak of belief, Glaube, instead of thesis. Thus Husserl writes, I quote, every experience, no matter how it operates, involves a doxa, a being belief, science Glaube. But in the essence of the external perception lies the fact that its corresponding horizon of experience, which is at the same time the belief horizon, Glaubenshorizont, comprises the whole of the world. Wall and transcendency in ideas. We have seen that the belief in the world in the sense of the general thesis of the natural attitude is a belief that is not direct towards single objects, but towards the horizon of the world as a whole. This is the reason why it cannot be suppressed, but only suspended by the phenomenological attitude. We all live within the world as the all-encompassing world horizon. Now, what about religious belief, faith? It is true that in the Ideas, first book, Husserl does not specifically address the question of belief in connection with faith and religion. But everyone follows the references Husserl provides in the note to paragraph 51, which are not only brief, but also negative in content. One may conclude that whereas the general thesis is directed towards the horizon of the world in the sense of the life world at large, faith has to do with an horizon of transcendency different from the transcendency of the world. He speaks here of a theological principle that can be drawn from the teleology running through the factual organization of the world. Such principle, I quote again, could not be assumed as something transcendent in the sense in which the world is something transcendent. End of quote. And then he adds, quote again, since the worldly God is evidently impossible, there must be therefore within the absolute stream of consciousness and its infinities, modes in which transcendencies are made known other than the constituting of physical entities. And in paragraph 58, Husserl makes some positions on this. He says that once we leave the realm of the natural world, we encounter another transcendency that, quote, becomes cognized in a highly mediated fashion, a transcendency standing as it were in polar contrast to the transcendency pertaining to the world. Remarkably, in copy A of the manuscript, he changes this highly mediated fashion for in an entirely different way. And this is, of course, the transcendency of God, which is revealed through the marvelous teleology pervading both the natural and the cultural world. Then he claims that from the point of view of religious consciousness, the same principle can be reached, which is led by a rational grounding motive. This motive grounds in turn in the believing in the existence of an extraworldly divine being. This divine being would then be absolute in a different sense than consciousness is said to be absolute, just as it would be something transcendent in a sense totally different from that in which the world is something transcendent. Now, in the research manuscripts that were gathered together in volume 42 of the Husserliana series, Husserl returns to this question of the religious consciousness, but in a more explicit way and in reference to religious belief. These manuscripts provide important indications regarding our main concern. In a text probably written in 1934, and much in the same vein of the introductory paragraphs of the Crisis, he meditates on the development of modern times by first considering Europe as a total historical concretion, that is, the historic spiritual supernation as intentional synthesis of Jews, Christianity, Greeks, and Hellenism. He distinguishes two main tendencies present in this spiritual stream, one evolving in a brilliant rise, that of modern science, and the other sinking into the shadows. And this is that of the genuine humankind, simply living in a naive ground steadiness or ground permanence, Bodenständigkeit. Next, he proceeds to explain the sense of this Bodenständigkeit. To begin with, it is a feature that pertains to genuine humankind, and Husserl describes it as a belief in the widest sense of the word. As such, this belief can develop in two forms, as religious belief and as a belief in reason. As to the first, he claims that this belief establishes a community among humanities and gives life and unity to their communal life and communal work. As a consequence, he underlines that man lives in belief. For this reason precisely, he lives in a world that has a sense for him or for her. And correlatively, his life, his existence in the world has sense for him. As to the belief in reason, Husserl argues here something that is similarly found in the Crisis text, namely that the belief in the autonomous reason is able to give man a genuine existence in the sense of a universal sense clarification, a Besinnung, and a self-normation following this sense clarification. He observes that in a historical consideration, both modes of belief, religious and rational, or we may say philosophical, have been for a long time in a tension, leading to annihilation wars and unifications in feeble peace. But in spite of these conflicts, the two modes share some essential key features in common. First of all, both provide humankind with Bodenständigkeit, ground steadiness. Additionally, what is believed in these beliefs is not an object, nor a set, or even a region of objects, in whatever sense of the word object. They are beliefs directed to something that is beyond all objective regions. Husserl claims that both religious and rational belief are able to set humankind free from the finitude that belongs to the surrounding world and open the way to discover infinitude and take possession of it as a totality. Religious belief being, so to speak, connatural to humankind, a transformation may occur by which the belief in the gods, plural, which is initially bound to a nation or a land and stands over against the God belief of the foreign nations, turns into a belief in a God who bears validity for all humankind, for every conceivable human being. This God evolves eventually into the unique God, I quote again, who has created and still creates the world with all nations, with the earth and the skies, the unending world, but who is uncreated, non-worldly, not in time or in space, etc. This transformation amounts to a transit from an open but finite surrounding world to an infinite totality of being as a horizon of human existence. In a parallel way, rational belief produces the same transformation in the transit to an autonomous reason. And in both cases, a teleology is involved. On the side of the religious belief, there is, so Husserl, a religious teleology that provides humankind and the world with a sense valid for everyone. It also delivers Bodenständigkeit, not only at the level of individuals, but also at the level of generativity, both in a national and a supranational sense. I briefly turn to the Kaizo article. We can find a parallel idea in one of the unpublished articles intended for the Japanese journal Kaizo. Husserl addresses the Christian religion this time and the transformation of regional national faith into a world religion, a Weltreligion. He describes a process whereby human groups free from the primitive animistic relationship to things and evolve in religious cultures ruled by norms that model the cultural life. Social, political, and cult organizations are built in a hierarchical structure guided by a universal Weltanschauung and a universal order of salvation, Heilsordnung. A living belief runs through this cultural humanity, binding the individuals together. Husserl exemplifies this type of religious culture with Babylon and the Jews. Now, in these communities, Husserl observes, the belief is inherited in a certain uncritical manner. But, quote again, since the capacity of critique belongs essentially to humans, for it has to do with freedom, it can be applied to the religious belief in two ways: in a religious freedom movement or in a development of free science outside the sphere of religious Stellungnahmen. The latter is, according to Husserl, the case with respect to the Christian belief. What happens to the individual in need of salvation is that she must meditate again on her relation to her God. That is, she tends to prove, like Jesus did, the available evidence and is led to a crisis. As a result, a transformation and Umgestaltung of the religion occurs based on a more original experience of God, which in turn releases religion from its nationalistic bonds and makes it aspire to a world religion. This amounts for Husserl the creation of a new religious type, one whose religious experience is no more bound to a merely irrational tradition, but emerges from rational sources, and thus it becomes universal. World belief and God belief. In sum, both the religious belief, faith, and the rational philosophical belief share the common feature of being directed not to a region of the world or to a specific life world, but to the total horizon of existence. In the case of the rational belief, this agrees with the difference Husserl makes in the crisis text and elsewhere between the world in singular and as the encompassing horizon of all particular horizons and life worlds, and this particular world in plural. It seems to me that Husserl is indirectly pointing to an analogous distinction when he describes the transit from a particular nation-bound religious faith to a universal faith valid in principle for every human being living in every or any particular life world. But we must note that the horizon of religious faith is not the world, but God. In this sense, Husserl describes how the religious human being refers this absolute burden of his worldly existence to a teleological center, to the creator, and sees herself in her life led by an ethical religious way, whereby she works as God's organ, as being in the service of God, as Husserl says. In another text, he links these considerations with ethics. After describing the teleological world in terms of the system of monads, he writes, I quote again, "It is as if an Aristotelian God would belong to the system of monads as the entelechy of its inner development, with many relative intellects assigned in eros to an idea of the good." And then, in accordance with the above-mentioned text of the ideas, he claims that God cannot be an object of experience in the sense of a thing or a human being. God would rather be experienced, note the quotation marks, in that belief, which in an original teleological way believes in the eternal value of that which lies in the direction towards the absolute art, solemn. And he then briefly describes such a teleological world intuition as an emotional anticipation, Gemütsanticipation, accompanying the life of humankind seen from a universal perspective, and always intending to give an ideal sense to the own nation, the community of nations and history. That is, intending to give, quote, a signification of eternity in the sense of realizing eternal values. Thus, belief in the sense of faith turns into confidence, Vertrauen. In spite of all misfortune and sorrow, beyond irrationality, such faith is in the divine providence, allows human life to gain in strength and swing. And precisely this strength is the strength of rational belief. In the same manuscript, he had already written that emotion is the proper source also for the belief in being, for convictions, and it is also a source of legitimation and Rechtsquelle in the sense of an anticipation of the ultimate sense of the world. Here we find a contrast with rational belief and a position closer to that of Scheler, as we mentioned at the beginning. Rational philosophical belief requires a foundation on evidence, and it aims at an absolute evidence in the form of full givenness. Faith, on the other hand, cannot claim such a givenness as a touchstone for evidence. Furthermore, as Husserl also observes, it is bound to tradition, and even though tradition is effective for building up enduring convictions, convictions lack the certitude of a rational foundation in the sense of a philosophical reason. The major difference with philosophical evidence lies in the lack of epistemic evidence, which is reflected on the fact that its negation is not false, but above all a sin, says Husserl. And it is fundamentally false because it is a sin not to believe. Nevertheless, the situation does not imply that faith is entirely irrational, since conviction provides another kind of evidence, the emotional evidence, Gemütsevidenz. Well, some very brief remarks to end this presentation. One, we can now link what Husserl says about the religious Glaube with the consideration he had made in Ideas. Whereas the natural attitude reflects a Glaube that is prior to any other beliefs in general, because it underlies them all, as their necessary presupposition, both the rational and the religious belief are built upon this Urglaube or protodoxe. Second, religious Glaube parallels the rational Glaube as far as both, in contrast with the particular attitudes described in paragraph 28 of the Ideas, do not relate to a set or a region of objects within the world, nor to the totality of all of them, but to the farthest horizon of experience. Third, being directed to the world, the rational belief points to the world as the horizon of all other horizons. Now, in harmony with paragraph 58 of the Ideas, the religious belief also points to a horizon, even though it is not the world horizon or a transcendency that goes beyond the transcendency of the world. This is also why both beliefs can be taken separately. Fourth, genetically considered, both beliefs undergo a process of development. To begin with, faith is historically previous to philosophical belief. And whereas the rational belief emerges from the natural attitude and evolves towards a universal rational teleology, the religious belief evolves from particular nation-bounded belief to a universal faith valid for each and every human being. And in the two cases, Husserl describes this evolution as a transit from finitude to infinity. Interestingly, in the end, both kinds of belief converge, as a famous passage in Husserliana 42 witnesses. I quote, "An autonomous philosophy like the Aristotelian, which like it remains an eternal requirement, eventually arrives to a philosophical teleology and theology as a non-confessional way to God." And we can recall what Husserl wrote to his old friend Gustav Albrecht in December 1935. "In the end, philosophy is for me my non-religious way to God, so to speak, my atheistic way to God. Without a certain clarity in these highest and last questions, I cannot die." Thank you very much.